with Ignacio. So shall we?
8 years ago, the president of Mexico, facing a highly contested election, decided to declare a war on drugs. To do this, he called the military to the streets. The results were that Mexico went from having 9,900 murders per year in 2005 to 23,000 in 2013. On December 2012, Enrique Peña Nieto from the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, became president of Mexico. The PRI was in power from the 1920s until 2000 and had many accusations of disappearance and violence against students. Forms, most of them related to the economy. He invested heavily in putting Mexico's image abroad, running various editorials in world newspapers, and pushed security to a less prominent place than his predecessor. Yet, the violence continued. Not because it is not a problem, it makes the most of it. In 2013 alone, 23,000 people were killed. 1 out of 3 homes reported to have been set and even the government says that 90% of crimes were ever resolved. On September 26th, a group of students was protesting on Iguana. The local police intervened, killed 6 students and arrested the other 43. There is no record of the students Except for 10 mass graves were discovered around Tijuana. The mayor of the town and his wife ran away after a
Sam, I think you need to change the output for sound on the computer.
Yeah. By the time we do that, it might be.
We are streaming, like.
Oh, okay.
So not on the other.
I can see
Yeah, we can just say it.
We're doing really great.
It's like longer to.
Yes, I love that show. I liked it, but when I was I like befriended this
Okay, so that video, we had a hard time with the sound, and especially with people entering, it was harder to hear than otherwise would have been. So we'll begin. I'm Professor Sam Steinberg from Spanish and Comparative Studies, and this is Professor Ignacio Sanchez Prado from Washington University, Spanish and Latin American Studies. He will probably be able to summarize what we were trying to show with the film, whose sound was not working easily. So please join me in welcoming Professor Sanchez Prado, and he'll talk to us about the situation in Mexico now. Okay?
Thank you for being here. This is a very important event for all of us in Mexico regarding the 43 disappeared in Ayotzinapa. As you know, this is part of a global forum that is streaming now online from different universities around the world. And in Mexico, it's a national day of protest and strike. So all universities are closed and marching today. They are coming from 3 different contingents in different parts of Mexico City, for instance, meaning into the central part of Mexico. So what I'm gonna do here is, an old school teaching where I'm gonna make a small presentation about the 2 or 3 things that we should be thinking about regarding this event. How can we make sense of it, especially being such a gruesome occurrence? and the kinds of more structural problems that are embedded in the disappearance of this 43, and the reason why this has become such an iconic. So I'm going to speak for a little while, and then I'm going to open the floor for the questions of anybody interested. One of the reasons of why we're grateful that you're here is because the one thing that has kept this situation in the table and hasn't allowed the Mexican government get away with sweeping it under the rug is because of international attention. They can ignore Mexican protesters, but they cannot ignore international media, international students, international government. So we're not asking for much. We're just asking for them to remain on the search of the students, to not forget about them, to not give them for dead, to not give alternative versions, to not try to criminalize them as drug dealers or something like that, but for them to be able to account for these students who were missing. If you're undergraduate students, the students that we're talking about, whose pictures are in the back, they're your age. They're college students. They're students who are teaching in a university that educates rural teachers. They come from the poorest part of Mexico, the state of Guerrero, the indigenous parts. They are peasants, indigenous peoples, who are preparing themselves to teach peasants and indigenous peoples in rural schools that are underfunded and marginalized. This massacre has a lot of subtext that would be very important for us to know. The facts are that these students were collecting money for them to be able to participate in a national event that happens every year on October 2nd for the commemoration of the massacre of students in Tlatelolco in Mexico City in 1968. They collect money to be able to afford the trip to the protest in Mexico City. While they were doing this, the wife of the Presidente Municipal or Mayor of the city of Iguala, José Luis Abarca, who has been tied by family ties to a criminal organization, was preparing an event to launch her candidacy for the mayor's office. As a result of this, she instructed the local police to stop the students from demonstrating themselves to the events for her event to go well. But then part of the instruction was for the police to hand over the students to a paramilitary criminal organization called Guerreros Unidos, which is a breakup from our cartel that was created because of the Mexican government policy of arresting cartel leaders. It's not strictly a drug cartel anymore, though. It's more like a general paramilitary organization that is fundamentally funded by the city of Iguala in order to carry dirty police work. They also have ties to the traffic of heroin and opium in the state of Guerrero, which is one of the main paths. So, it has been very iconic because of the type of person who was disappeared. There's, of course, not 43 people missing. In Mexico, there's 25,000 people missing today. This adds to about 100,000 people who have been killed, murdered in the last few years. If you think about it in a comparative manner, in the same amount of years, there's 4 times more people killed and disappeared in Mexico right now than in the Argentine or the Chilean dictatorship, even though Mexico is purportedly a democratic regime. So, this is a tremendous amount of people who are missing or dead, and the fact that these are young people, these are students, these are activists, has been has allowed for this to be more on the table than many of the other people disappear. You know that one of the gruesome things that have happened as a result of the search is that they keep finding mass graves, one after the other, after the other, after the other, and nobody knows who those people are. They have been able to identify a few of them, many of them they're still unidentified, but it gives you a sense that a lot of those 25,000 people missing are actually lying in mass graves that are yet to be found all over Mexico. Whenever we face a situation like this, it is very easy to stop on the denunciation of the violence. I think that in the university context where we are, in something like a teaching, we're not supposed to do that. We're supposed to think about these problems. I think that just raising our loud voice is not enough. I think that we have to understand why a local government in this case disappears 43 people happens. We have to understand why 25,000 people go missing. This is also a very personal thing for me, not only because of being Mexican, but I live in St. Louis, Missouri. And as you know, the killing of Michael Brown in St. Louis just took place. We're going to hear from the grand jury probably this weekend. And I live in an African American neighborhood in St. Louis, and I know for a fact that there's gonna be a lot of anger if that officer doesn't get indicted, which is what we think is gonna happen. In addition to that, it's Missouri, so you know the Ku Klux Klan is supporting Darren Wilson, so they're providing support for him. And I think that one of the problems with the case of Ayotzinapa and the case of Michael Brown is that in the difference of scale, they're the same situation. It is the situation of people in vulnerable social positions turned into disposable, into people not considering that their lives are worth it. It is people that do not fit or belong into the narratives of modernization and progress that those of us in the middle and upper classes embrace. They face the indifference of a tremendous amount of people. We are a culture of selfishness. If we only care about the stuff that relates directly to us, we have no symbolic connection to people that are in situations less favorable by us, people who are from different nationalities, from different races. And this is all a culture that allows for a police officer to shoot a young African American man, for a government to go disappear 43 students, and then for many people in the middle and upper classes, to which most of us here belong, to think, you know, they're criminals, it's okay, the police officer was defending himself, the students were asking for it because they're like rioters, or what do I care, you know, I have to pass my calculus exam because, you know, who cares, right? The fact is that one thing that we have to realize is that we're complicit in this. Because what it's the fight and the problem is that what we call neoliberalism, or the current model of free market economics that is predominant all around the world, that is a system that is constructed to favor a lot of people, like many of us here, at the expense of other people, right? It is not a system that produces economic justice, it is a system that produces economic inequality. People like Michael Brown or like the students in Ayotzinapa are people that do not fit in the economic model, right? If you believe that poor people shouldn't get welfare because you have to pay less taxes, then that means that you don't care about the life of Michael Brown. If you believe, like it happens in Mexico, that rural teachers, as it happened in an education reform that passed that year, shouldn't get tenure or shouldn't get permanent positions because you have to do standardized testing and so on, you do not care about the lives of the young rural teachers who have to make a living in situations that we as people in a private university, in a city, cannot even begin to understand. So I think that whenever we're trying to explain this massacre is not just about some bad rotten apples who are just going into killing students. These are massacres where everybody who benefits from the economic system has a certain degree of complicity, sometimes by indifference, sometimes by proactive participation, sometimes by the support of politicians that promote policies that do not take into consideration these vulnerable people who are the ones that need human rights protections, economic protections the most. We're complicit because we're selfish. We're complicit because we do not have an imagination that allows us to understand that poor people, that minorities, that indigenous people, peasants, they're the same human beings as we are, and not someone whose life is disposable, right? If you see this is the last thing that I'm gonna say because I would rather give sufficient time for those of you to ask questions. One of the things that is going on in here is that the Ayotzinapa Rural School where these students come from, it has been a thorn on the side of many projects of development and modernization in Mexico since the 1930s. It was created by the socialist government of Lázaro Cárdenas as part of a national project for creating national free public education, which they succeeded in doing in many different ways. The teachers who live in that kind of place in Mexico, they are not connected to the type of ideologies of development that someone in Mexico City, right, or in the big urban areas would foster. They understand the problem that maybe it is more important for a student in that area to know his or her indigenous language than English. That you're not going to be trained to work in industry because there's no industry, right? that there are problems of poverty that the education system can address. So this school has always been at the forefront of fighting for social justice for the people in the region. It has produced some very combative social movements. This is not by any means the first time there's a massacre there. In the 1970s, there was a guerrilla movement led by a man called Lucio Cabañas, who was also a student here. They called themselves the Political Party of the Poor People, el Partido de los Pobres. And they were essentially trying to counter the narratives of development coming from the central government in the 1970s. There was a massacre in the state of Guerrero in the 1990s called Aguas Blancas. The president that was considered to be now complicit in the massacre, he's now a professor in Harvard, so he's perfectly, unpunished by this, Ernesto Cedillo. Interestingly, the governor of Guerrero at the time of the Ayotzinapa massacre was the person who came to substitute the governor in Aguas Blancas, so he cleaned up that mess, and now he has this mess in his hand. So this is not an isolated event. There's a history of a massacre every decade in there. Because every time a central government in Mexico tries to pull a policy of development that damages the economy of local people, this very politicized school produces a social movement, and the state's first reaction is to repress it. And in this case, it was repressed into something that is actually unprecedented, which is a larger tie between the formal government and organized crime than ever before. So in the 1970s, it will be the army. Today, it is a government that is tied to a criminal organization, and the criminal organization is actually conducting the killing. It is the same rationale. It is just a different device that is tied to the war on drugs and to different things. But one thing that I think is very important, this is the last thing I'm going to say, this is not about the war on drugs. That is the simplistic explanation that the Mexican government favors, because then they can pin it on drug cartels, on criminals, and they can abdicate from the responsibility. This is a state crime. It was carried by members of the local government, and it has failed to find justice because of the disinterest of the federal structures of the federal government. The political parties in power in the federal government and in power in Guerrero, one of them the PRI in the federal, the PRD, which is a supposed left-wing party in Guerrero, they are complicit because they have produced the officials that were directly related to this. So the governor Angel Aguirre, the former governor, he was in the PRI, he's now in the PRD, he used to clean up the Aguas Blancas massacre, he's now on the other part. And of course the third political party in Mexico, the PAM, they are responsible for the larger subtext of that, because the extremely misguided policy of the war on drugs has actually emboldened and strengthened criminal organizations throughout Mexico. If you ask why Guerreros Unidos exists, it's because under the Calderón administration, they arrested a drug cartel collector, Beltrán Leiva. They killed him, actually. And this is a part of the organization that when this cartel got dissolved, they broke out and they went out of drugs and they started being subsidized as a paramilitary police. So you would think that prosecuting drug cartel leaders is a good thing, but it's actually one of the worst ways to fight drug gangs. Because whenever you lose those leaderships, the organization splinters, so instead of having one, you have 7. The one thing that they have to do, which any expert knows, is that they have to go target the money and target money laundering, a lot of which happens here in California. But that goes to banking interests, financial interests that they don't want to touch. It is easier to show to the television a cartel leader than actually going to the root cause of a lot of these problems. So, it is a network of violence that is very tragic. It's created by poor law enforcement. It is created by the inability of the Mexican state of producing a structure of development that includes these people. It's an inability that is not current. It's an inability that has happened for the last 500 years. People fight for their rights, and the government, instead of engaging with them in a democratic manner and instead of bringing them into the dialogue for modernization, they would rather repress. This happened to Michael Brown. This happens in Ayotzinapa. It's not only a Mexican problem, it is a global problem because it's a problem of the economic model. In Mexico, we have a very gruesome situation because it's 43 that we're missing. In St. Louis is 1, but it is the same structure. Okay, so that's what I'm going to say. And I welcome your questions and comments because this is supposed to be a collective organization for the hour.
Thank you, Ignacio. So we'll open to questions from you now.
I mean, my question is, where do you begin when trying to make these like structural changes to start seeing a difference in in the power of these military organizations? And then my second question is, do you think it's necessary to have international support? Not necessarily just international, media attention to actually make these changes.
For the first question, actually I'm going to start with the second question. What the international support helps, I do not think that mobilization directly solves the problem, of course, right? The point of mobilizing is awareness. And the point of awareness is that it keeps the international pressure, because if you keep getting coverage in the New York Times, in the Guardian, right? And in Force, which has actually been following the story very closely, the project of modernization that the government is fostering becomes in danger, right? The government really wants foreign investment right now. They're about to privatize the energy industry. This is a very inconvenient thing for them to happen at this time. So they want to disappear it. They want it to go away and present the idea of a peaceful Mexico that you can invest in and so on. So part of the problem here is that this movement of teachers has been mobilized further because of these reforms. So they passed a labor reform that took a lot of, an education reform that took a lot of labor rights from teachers. And for these teachers in this area of the country, it is the difference between starving or not to have those rights. So the pattern here is that modernization, as we support it, is something that profoundly affects the lives of very vulnerable people. And sometimes we, in the positions of privilege, of class privilege, we do not realize that this is the case, right? So awareness is not only, of an event like this, is not only for us to keep the pressure in the Mexican government, which is the immediate priority, but it is also for us to understand the consequences of the policies that we support as voters, right? And that's where we can change. If you support a government that tells you that poor people are moochers, then you're a part of the problem. If you support a government like in Mexico that tells you that in order to improve an educational system that is indeed disastrous, the first place to start is destroying the labor rights of teachers, then you're part of the problem, because it is not true. The problem in education is that the government doesn't want to provide enough resources, because all of these governments identify development with the reduction of the size of the government, right? They want to privatize education, they want to put standardized tests and those things. And we know in the US, because we have been in this system for many years, that has actually worsened education. So, but people in these political parties are very dogmatic. I mean, if you see the current president of Mexico, I'm not someone that is going to start speculating about intentionality here, because I do not have any reason to say that he's a bad guy or a good guy or something, right? The current president of Mexico comes from a political nobility and is married to a soap opera star. Before he's forced into government, he probably never saw a poor person before. That's the structure of the government. There is a fundamental lack of knowledge of the consequences of the policies that they are fostering in the everyday life of the people who do not have access to government structures. If you think about Michael Brown, for example, Ferguson is a place that is 70% African American, but 6 out of 7 seats in the city council are white. That's not a problem necessarily, right? Because of course white people can be solidarious with minorities and so on. The problem is that the government ideology in Ferguson is that they are really afraid of that black majority, and they want to keep it back as long as they can, because oh my God, whenever we're a minority, what are we gonna do, right? When in the case of St. Louis, the fact that African Americans are a majority has had zero consequence. It affects the lives of no white person. But the government is based on a paranoia, because a lot of irresponsible politicians cultivate fear of social change from us, right? The complicity is not proactive. Like, it's not that, the voters who support these politicians are bad people or anything like that. We don't have to be simplistic about it. It is that whenever fear mobilizes you, then you start making decisions that look right. Whenever you think that the growth of minorities or the more public presence of indigenous peoples in the case of Mexico are gonna affect you somehow, right? Then you start, for example, in Missouri joining the Ku Klux Klan. or voting for the kind of guy that wants to go out the state government, abolish the income tax and do the kind of thing, because all of these policies about keeping the people who are down, so nothing changes in society. You are not really afraid of the people necessarily, but you're afraid of the change. What the Ayotzinapa people do in Mexico is the same thing. It is people that remind those of us who benefit from the model of development that it doesn't benefit everyone, that needs to be changed. But if you're in the position of people who benefits, you don't want it to change. Because you're afraid as to what change is going to entail for you. That's why I'm saying that one of the problems is selfishness, right? So I think that what we have to do is, in part, we're not the kind of people who are going to go do immediate change. I'm not the kind of person that lives on that kind of illusion necessarily. But I think that if we live in a society where we do have a certain power to vote at all levels, we need to vote what we're voting for. And we need to organize for the candidates to actually support the kinds of policies that are inclusive to everyone. We want to make sure that whenever we're electing someone, we're not electing someone that is starving people out of existence, that we're not electing someone that is destroying the livelihood of rural teachers, that we're not electing someone that instead of investing in the community, which is what happens in Ferguson, they are militarizing the police. So one thing that we wonder in St. Louis is why the hell does the Ferguson police didn't take all the money they used to buy military equipment, which is very expensive, in developing the black neighborhood? Paving the street, helping in building the school, putting like a tree, something that makes the people, the African American community, not persecuted, but included, right? It's not about, giving them your money or anything like that. It is about considering that most of the political and economic systems that we have developed in the history of humankind are exclusionary by nature, and that if the process of progress is not creating wealth per se, but is creating inclusion. Because a massacre, or a disappearance, or a mass disappearance, or the murder of a kid by the police, all of those things are not a bad apple that happened, but they are a symptom of a system that cannot engage with its more vulnerable people. Anybody else wants to?
I think you said earlier that there's a fundamental shift in which party was holding power. I think you said in the 1970s the military was like the fundamental,
Yes.
Aggressive, fundamental force of aggression.
Yes.
Whereas currently it's more paramilitary and
Yeah.
the cartels. So I wanted to know if the globalization and privatization of Mexico was giving more political presence in the cartels, and the reason why the politicians are so complicit is because cartels are lobbying, or perhaps have more political power than we expected.
Okay. So the process that has happened in Mexico with globalization in terms of the government is that the Mexican government is a huge centralized government, right? And it was a regime where during 70 years we only had one political party winning all elections. Whenever you have that system, you have a bunch of problems of authoritarianism, because they deploy the army, the police, and so on to be able to hold that monopoly of power, right? We had something that we call the transition to democracy, where that monopoly broke. We created two more political parties, right? The problem is that the structure is not gone. That same monopoly still exists, but it's divided by three political parties instead of one. But it hasn't been a process of full inclusion of people into the political system. But the thing is that the second thing that happens is that, as you know, one of the mantras of globalized capitalism is we have to reduce the government, cut the government's bad. That idea was received very enthusiastically in Mexico because we were sick of the centralized government with reason. But the problem is that the Fox and the Calderon administrations, they dismantled a lot of the structure and they outsourced the structure to the local and state governments. They are more prone to corruption. It is very hard to bribe the president, but it is very easy to bribe a mayor. So if the mayor has more power, the organizations can more easily infiltrate the city government. The thing that we have to see, though, is that capitalist development is one thing. Whether the economy is legal or illegal, it functions the same way. NAFTA and drug trafficking are parallel phenomena because it is a phenomenon of increasing the circulation of capital between Mexico and the United States. The fact is, though, that there's more money in the shadow economy than in the formal economy for many reasons, especially if you're poor. but also especially if you're a politician. So if we see Jose Luis Abarca, the mayor of Iguala, the problem, he's a politician. He might have been a legitimate politician who wanted to be in office and so on, but the wife is related to a criminal organization by family. Her brothers are two operators of a cartel. If you go to the state of Michoacan, which is one of the hotspots, there have been reports in the New Yorker, for instance, where top businessmen are marrying their sons to the daughters of leaders of drug cartels. So, the distance between formal and informal economy, criminals and non-criminals, it's blurred, right? So that's what has happened. And because this is blurred, a state that is still authoritarian, they have resources of repression they do not necessarily have to mobilize the military and burn themselves, but they can mobilize a drug cartel to which they may have economic ties, family ties, and so on. And then they can say, it was los criminales, it wasn't the state, right? That's one of the narratives here. It was los guerreros unidos, it wasn't really the state. The problem is that you cannot make the distinction. There are networks of continuity, because in this decentralization of power, they never made sure to protect the local structures of government, which are very important, from infiltration. So I think that one of the ways to address this crisis in the long term is that we need to reconstruct the structures of local government. We do not have a powerful centralism anymore, but what we want is a functional structure of local government that holds the rule of law at the local level, and that is protected institutionally from the temptation of corruption, right? That they have the capacity to fight the organizations at the local level, because no one wants to have, even the people who run for office, they don't like to be extortioned by cartels. But they don't have the resources to be able to withhold the pressure.
Yeah, I have a comment and a question.
Yes.
The comment isn't really about the drug war, but specifically on what you said about in Ferguson,
Uh-huh.
how the police aren't putting money into like the environment.
Mhm.
There's a book called The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell, I think, and it talks about how when there was like extreme high rates of crime in New York, the New York police chief, instead of putting money into more forces for police, he attempted to like completely clean up all the subways and make it a place that was enjoyable, and ended up like cutting crime rates in half just due to the environment that people are surrounded by and feel like they're more welcome in the community. So I think that's really interesting. But my question is, if like the general public of Mexico is like aware of the situation that's going on, or if they're being like blinded by the like what the government's broadcasting as being, a democracy.
I think that what you're seeing, which is unique, is that they're fighting to stay aware. That's how I would put it, right? It is understood, it's a half-truth, it's partially true and partially not, that there's like a hegemonic media that lies to you, right? There are some members of that do, and some people who do report, but they report partially and so on, because they're corporate media, they have economic interests. We cannot expect from a corporation that is in the stock market to give you the full truth about something. That's here in China or wherever you want, because their purpose is not to inform you, to make money, right? So they don't want to alienate audiences, they don't want to have a relationship with the state that provides them the licenses. It's a neutral judgment. It's not that, oh my God, because you can be very self-righteous about things, but it is really a limitation of the way in which we get information. What happens, if you see the divide in Mexico right now, the vast majority of people, a lot of them are in the streets, many of them are solidarios. A lot of people want to know what exactly happened. They don't want, the versions that the government has put suggesting that a few of them may have been infiltrated by cartels, and some people have not really bought that. So, but at the same time, there's a bunch of people who are believers in the model of development, and you see a lot of newspaper columns saying, these people they protested too much. So that they deserve it, or at least they imply that they deserve it because, they were like burning buses and so on. I am not an activist type. This is probably one of the first few of these that I've ever done, and I will not do very many because I'm not a person that likes to be mobilized all the time. I'm the kind of person that likes to think, that likes to teach in a classroom. But I can tell you that, and as such, I'm not the kind of person that would go into the street and throw a Molotov cocktail anywhere or torch anything. It's not the way I think things should be done. Even if you do that, however, I do not think that you should be disappeared for doing that. Right? I think that you have to understand the people who are able to do something like that in that they're in a desperate situation. And whenever you want to throw a Molotov cocktail, it's not because you enjoy it, but it's because all other channels of communication with your state have failed. And part of the failure has been this. And I think that one of the things that has happened is that if you think that this 43 are part of 125,000 people dead and missing, many people have family members who are missing, people are afraid of driving in highways because you might be kidnapped. Even upper class people are targets of kidnappings, right? So it is not that you cannot be in a social situation where you're going to be impervious. So people are sick of a narrative that just protects the government from its responsibility for providing security. So even if you're not very concerned about the kind of person, you're not very concerned about justice, because you have this disconnect that just blocks you from understanding what these people's lives are, and you completely disagree with their politics. There's even, in that case, people who still think that this is an alarming development in terms of the security that the state should be providing. So even if you're conservative, middle class, and so on in Mexico today, and this is a change in this movement, this is the first time that conservative people in Mexico are allying themselves with the left wing in demanding a response for the 43 people missing, because I think that we have reached a tipping point where a lot more people are aware of the problem that the current situation faces. I think that for many years there has been a denial, saying, there's people missing, but we're passing an energy reform and an education reform, and we're being modern, and it's just a matter of time. But I think that doesn't work anymore. Yes?
I would like just to add to that. I think that the system is I think that the problems are even deeper. I think it even goes back to just the colonial history of Mexico. Because if you look at all these students, their phenotype tends to be predominantly like indigenous. When you go to states like Guerrero, Michoacán, Puebla, Oaxaca, Yucatán, Quintana Roo, which are predominantly on the south, which are predominantly had a history of agrarian livelihoods, are the ones that got targeted. They got hit extremely hard with NAFTA. When the United States subsidized their corn farming, Mexico's #1 staple in their diet is tortilla made out of corn, and it got decimated. Those individuals have no other choice but to come to the United States. There are pipelines from Puebla to New York, from Oaxaca to Texas. So these massacres they're not taking place in states where I'm from. I'm from Jalisco. That doesn't really, it's not something that we hear. We do hear narratives of like, oh, this person got kidnapped. But when we hear this kind of gruesome, it's just the way they were killed or disappeared. It's more status quo. We hear these things on a daily basis. So when I see it in international forum, I'm like, there's a history of not just of racism towards the more indigenous individuals versus those like myself who have more of a mestizaje or more of a European blending. And it's not as tacit as it is in the United States. Racism in the United States is so insidious. So when you really think about policies that are taking place even in education, and how these policies are specifically created, as you said, by neoliberalism to create a service sector to work in a certain part of the economy where it allows other individuals to run the city or to design the city, we see that it is these individuals again that continuously to live a legacy of colonialism. And these are the individuals that get targeted. And it's not just centralized to Mexico, but we're seeing the impacts of immigration. I'm a teacher and I see all the students that I get. They're students from Guerrero, from Oaxaca. We see the violence that even stems down to for our brothers who from Guatemala. So this is really systemic, and it's more endemic of some of the horrible impacts of globalization. And when we really think about modernity, we really think about modernity for which countries?
Or for which people within the countries?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is part of the problem that we have to address, right? One of the questions is, how does life become so disposable that you can kill or disappear someone like this, right? And especially in an unpunished matter. Race is always a factor in this, because there's a racial hierarchy where if you're of certain racial position or composition, you are more vulnerable than someone who isn't, right? If you're black in St. Louis, you are more likely to be shot by the police than if you're white. If you are an indigenous leader in Guerrero, you're more likely to be repressed, right? When you see demonstrations in Mexico City, whenever it is, all the middle class people dressed in white, like going out and, protesting in favor of non-violence, they just let them walk on the street just fine, Even now, for example, the gay pride parades, those don't get repressed, which is a great thing, of course. But whenever it was the teachers' unions that came to protest the education reform law before this, if you went to Twitter, oh, these Indios are on my way, they don't let me get to work, they should get to work, right? That's a very Mexican thing to say to protesters. They don't work, they're lazy, right? They're lazy here protesting instead of... it was unbelievable the amount of vitriolic racism that came out of people backlashing against the protest. Because, one of the things, whenever we are bourgeois and middle class, one thing that stops us from being solidarious is when we're inconvenienced, right? So if the protest creates traffic, then you start demonizing the people who are protesting because they're on your way, right? And that's one of the ways in which the media manages to criminalize the protest. Oh my God, they blocked the airport, right? We're not going to be able to go to our weekend in Acapulco. They're closing the university, and I want to take class because I want to get an A, because I'm so special, I'm a snowflake, and I want to be successful with my skills. Why are all these brown people closing my school, So that's the kind of thing that happens. Solidarity doesn't happen because that kind of what we call white privilege now, which is the fashionable term to mention, but it is actually the fact that when you are privileged, the privilege is also the obliviousness to the plight of others. That's really the privilege. The privilege is not only that you are not going to be arrested or something, but it is that you can get away with not caring, right? And that you can be annoyed if your bourgeois little life gets blocked by the demands of other people, or the Fisher versus Texas case on the Supreme Court. Oh my God, these brown people going to university instead of me. I'm a mediocre student, so maybe I shouldn't go to college anyways. But I'm angry that the brown people got in and I didn't, right? So if you see all the discourse of one thing that we are seeing now, for example, is people of Asian and Asian American descent. We're seeing them on the both ends of the spectrum. We have a lawsuit in Harvard where people of Asian descent said they're being discriminated because of affirmative action. But then we have in California proactive attempts to not let Asians into top universities because they say there's too many, and what is going to happen to the white students. All of these things have to do with the fact that we are always managing privilege from our positions, right? We're not the people who get disappeared, as you say. Which is why I think that knowledge is a very important thing, because to achieve empathy and solidarity, you have to understand the nature of the plight, but you also have to understand the continuities between your privilege and the plight of those people. Like whenever you are paying less taxes, someone is paying for that in the lower ranks of the scale. That whenever you don't want to be inconvenienced in your commute, is because someone actually is trying to get your attention for the support. Whenever you vote for the political party that is going to favor you, that political party is going to screw someone over, right? So it is race, it is class, which should never be forgotten. There's a demonization not only of indigeneity, but also of poverty. Poor people are lazy, they don't do what they do, right? They're lazy because they poor because they want to. I'm great because I'm middle class and I work super hard. One thing that I always find very frustrating is people who make a living talking on television, which is probably one of the easiest jobs you could possibly have. Like saying, spitting ignorance on Fox News or something like that. Saying that people working on a McDonald's are lazy, that's of a level of cynicism that is astonishing. I dare them to go work a shift in McDonald's. And it's the same thing with the maestros, right? Oh, they're lazy, they should go to class. I dare you to teach in that classroom. I dare you to try to deal in a classroom with the limitations of teaching with students that do not really speak Spanish, who are poor, who are starving in their house, who have to come from school after working 4-hour shifts in the fields, and then tell me if you're not going to be protesting. Yes?
Yeah, well, thanks for being here and thanks for everyone to assist. As you know, we are live streaming, so we have a question from Argentina right now. Ali ask if you can talk about what will be the contribution of a solidarity of civil society groups from Latin American countries which have gone through periods of state terrorism for the present situation in Mexico. And before that, because we don't have too much time, I want to add a comment and a question to debate, maybe, because as you mentioned before, in Mexico everything works,
Yes.
quote unquote. So yeah, Jalisco it's a conservative state. Everybody knows about that in Mexico. But also there are a lot of social mobilizations outside the city. But in the cities, the life goes normally, But outside the metropolitan situations, it's a kind of war for indigenous and peasants and that kind of organizations. But yeah, Jalisco doesn't have the tradition of guerrero, the political tradition, and it's not engaged with what happens in the city, But at the same time, well, we listen a lot of arguments, kind of this is the crisis of state, this is the end of state, the state is going down because and so on. But for me, it looks like this indistinguishability between crime and law. It's in the heart of the state, and maybe never before the Mexican state was too strong, but it's strong to kill. So that's the power of law, the power of state at the end. So the traditional structures of capitalism and the institutional state becomes blurred. And well, the violence, the monopoly of violence, for example, it's not anymore just the police, the state.
It has
violence.
never been. That's a misunderstanding.
That's one kind of the questions to discuss, because yeah, Mexico has a long history of that dissemination of violence or this question of the monopoly of violence. So in one hand, we are in a kind of operative issue when we think that, because what we can think, where we can move on that situation, because the privatization of violence, the narco business, it's one business more, the most relevant maybe, but it's one business more. Everybody knows that. There are no one politician in Mexico, there is no related to that business. And everybody knows that, but what happens? So how we can move in that? It's the state form, it's the neoliberalism, and how to engage that with the political categories that we have to think that, and also to do things in a political way.
Well, here's the thing. I have an opinion that is probably not shared by many people. I do not think that talking about violence is productive. Because when you're talking about violence, you are quantifying, right? So your quantity is 43, it's 25,000, or it's 1 in Ferguson, right? They're the same problem. It can kill sometimes 1,000, and it can kill sometimes 50 or 72, like the migrants in San Fernando, right? Or 1. When it kills 1, it's already a problem. But to focus on the analysis of violence itself is a silly way of bailing yourself out from the question. When you talk about the level of state terrorism, like the friend from Argentina is asking, we have an experience in Latin America that Mexico didn't have in the same way. Our dirty war was much smaller in scale, more under the ground. We didn't have that kind of dictatorship like the junta in Argentina or the Pinochetism in Chile. So that experience is always valuable. But I think that the thing that really matters is that the Pinochetismo and what we're seeing now are the same problem, which is a fundamental struggle for the nature of economic modernization in Latin America. So how are you going to develop Latin America into modernity? That is the big question always there. The point of being of the dictatorship was the dislodging of welfare states, populist regimes, socialist regimes that provided, very imperfect in many ways, but at least they had a rhetoric of inclusion of the people who were marginalized, right? Peronismo, for all its faults, was about that. Salvador Allende was about that. Interestingly, the Mexican Revolution was also like that, and Mexico was very successful in incorporating for many years many people into the economic model, which is one of the reasons why we never had a coup in the same way it happened in South America. What neoliberalism discovered is that you don't have to have a military dictatorship to dismantle this. You can just elect a government democratically, create a bunch of fears, fear about the big state, fear about poor people, fear about, economic crisis, right? Why are we, all of those of you who are undergraduate students here, you know the fear, right? Am I gonna get a job? I'm gonna graduate with this many thousands of dollars of debt, right? I don't know if do I have to work for free, or as we call it, have an internship, in order for me to be able to succeed? You are suffering from that because all of those insecurities that you yourselves are facing, even from your position of privilege, I teach in a private university too, is because they have stolen from you the things that used to protect you from those things. So the normalcy that you mentioned is exactly the point. The normalcy is that they have discovered that they can dismantle all the things that protect every one of us except the top of the elite without anybody opposing it. Because now they have discovered that they can do targeted killings of the people who question or oppose it, like the Ayotzinapa 43, without having to have a full military dictatorship system. So you can go to Mexico City, go shopping, have a normal life, take a taxi, go party. I just did a month ago. They don't need to repress me. They just need to make certain violent interventions into certain things in order to keep it, right? So one of the big economic flows right now is the money that is generated by Guatemalan, Salvadoran, Nicaraguan immigrants trying to enter the United States through Mexico, which has produced a tremendous structure of human trafficking that generates a lot of profit for local police and for cartels because they have to go bribe people around. How did they manage to do that? They killed 72 migrants. 72 who refused to pay, they disappeared and they put them in mass grave. You haven't heard that a kind of massacre like that again. Why? Because everybody's paying now. They just needed one intervention. And it's the same thing. What they were hoping here is that this school that has been a thorn in the side of process modernization, if you disappear 43, then they're going to stop protesting. The miscalculation here was that the awareness was going to grow so long because the fact is, and that goes to our complicity, we haven't cared about 25,000 people. That's why it works. We like our normalcy. Or, to give us a little bit more credit, because we're also afraid. We're afraid of losing our jobs. We're afraid of being in Mexico. If you say these kinds of things in the press, they come after you. We're afraid of being threatened, right? And because of that fear, we do not mobilize. And who can blame you, right? That's part of the problem.
We have time for one more quick question, if there's one more quick one.
My name is Billy Vela. I'm the director here at Centro Chicano, that is a Latino culture center, and thank you so much.
Thank you for
this. It's very important to have these conversations. My question is, I'm glad that we're having a conversation about, obviously, the deaths and the situation in Mexico, and then connecting it broader to Latin America and even more globally. And we've talked about how it relates back here. So I kind of want to bring it back here. You talked about education.
Yes.
And the lack of that, and really the lack of, you were talking about the Mexican president, not knowing basically the situation with anybody else, because he was bourgeois and grew up with rich people, basically. So he has no empathy, no understanding, no care. So my question to you is, I think it was yesterday or the day before, LAUSD, right? They passed the ethnic studies requirement, right? To teach ethnic studies in high school. So I'd love to hear, yes, exactly. I'd love to hear your thoughts with respects to two things. How does that relate to the matter that we're talking about in Mexico? How could it relate? And then for me, as an administrator here at USC and working now 18 years at colleges, the question I had is, if they could do it in high school, why can't we do it at colleges and universities? Where it's mandatory that you actually take these classes.
It is mandatory in Washington University, actually.
And the impact that would have, that's kind of more my
Well, here is the thing, this is the problem. Whenever you think about ethnic and gender studies, the way they have worked this so far is that they become self-identity classes, right? If you go to a women's studies class, all women. If you go to a Mexican American studies class, it's 75 to 80% Mexican Americans and Mexicans, right? And Latinos. If you go to an African American studies class, it's 70-80% black students. That's understandable when we started that fight, right? Because of course we needed to have this moment of creation of academic self-awareness where people that come from traditions that have been historically excluded, we're able to learn about their histories, their traditions, and so on. But we're not there yet. I don't think you have an educated Mexican American that doesn't know about Mexican American identity. You don't have to teach those kinds of histories anymore because we have built upon that maybe in high schools, not in colleges, right? Because your question raised. I think that the challenge is to get everyone into those classes. And I think that the language of identity through which we have created those disciplines is never going to engage students that do not participate of that identity. I teach a survey of Latin American culture to a group of 40 students, 37 of which are white, 1 is African American, and 2 are Latinos. It's a very white university. My challenge is to make those 37 care about something that is not directly their history, right? There's of course a responsibility in the part of students to care something more about yourself, to take your head out of your ass, and of your privilege. But I don't think that's the only problem. I think there's also the problem of creating languages of engagement where these marginalized histories can start speaking in a more meaningful way for people that do not self-identify with them. We have a very big problem of differentiation of identities because since we have such a big cultural market, you can shop for your identity, right? You can drink your Kool-Aid all the time. Completely drink your Kool-Aid. So if you are like liberal, you can watch MSNBC and watch Democracy Now, read The Nation, right? Listen to the Arcade Fire. No, but I mean seriously, if you are conservative, you can watch Fox News, listen to Toby Keith, right? Go to your Tea Party rally. We have our privilege as in America is that we live in such a generous cultural market that we can just never be confronted, ever, right? And we have no encouragement to be confronted. And I think that one of the things is that we need to resist. And that actually has a name in economics. It's called cultural niche market. And you can make a lot of money on people drinking their Kool-Aid. So, of course, there's a willingness of not drinking only your Kool-Aid anymore. But we also need to produce our own thinking in a way that is not Kool-Aid. In a way that it is a more engaging culture and form of knowledge that actually creates these understandings, because I'm a pessimist, right? That's why I'm not an activist. There's a part of me that thinks that the Ayotzinapa thing is gonna go away. It's very difficult to say it, but that's our track record. The question is, when we find them, that I don't think should go away. When we find them, I think that the next question is how do we stop this from happening again? And being on the streets is not gonna do that either. I think that we need to start creating networks of knowledge and culture that allow us to understand ourselves in a more horizontal level instead of keeping in the consumption of the culture that we have now. Our current culture reproduces classism, it reproduces racism, it reproduces indifference, right? If you think that if everything that you consume in your culture validates you, then you think you're right all the time. You have no ears. That's why we have people in Washington fighting for stupid things, because they're not that different, those two parties, but you would think that they are like, the communists and the fascists in 1930. But they're not. They're just, the central right and the more to the central right party. But they fight like that because this culture of validation, all it does is that it makes you think you're right, it makes you think your opponent is wrong and dangerous and so on. So there's no engagement. So what I would say is, yes, we need to have ethnic studies mandatory everywhere, and gender studies too, by the way. I would like to have the exact demographic composition of the institution to be represented as such in all of these classes. And in order to achieve this goal, we need to rethink the way in which we think these disciplines for the conversation to happen. So when I teach my survey of Latin American culture class, it's peppered with examples about the United States. Because if I don't explain it to you in terms of the experience of the people who are not the identity that you're teaching, then you're never going to create that bridge. You're never going to have many in women's studies classes if they think that feminism is male bashing. Right? Yeah.
Whose responsibility is it to do that?
Ours. We're the professors.
Who's out? Just professors?
Professors, students, engaged students. This is a business, universities, right? What students want now, and parents particularly, because we have, of course, you know helicopter parents, because you probably have a few of them. Students and parents shop in universities for pretty campuses, extracurricular activities, curriculum building, skills building, because everybody's afraid that they're going to get a job and you want to shop for an experience. So what do we get? New buildings, the sports clubs, right? Classes about how you're going to have the skill that this employer is going to more efficiently put you into the cog of their machine. Nobody's nobody's shopping for intellectual experience. Whenever the students demand that, then the universities are going to cater because the universities want the tuition dollars. I think that there's no reason why the students shouldn't want that. I think that it enriches their life, and I think the only reason why students don't want it is because they're afraid of unemployment. And I think that the anxiety forces you to just be looking for skills. The fact is that they can sell you those skills you want, and you're still going to be underemployed. And in the meantime, you will have been robbed from a very meaningful intellectual experience that you could have had in college, and you're not, because you're only taking classes that you're only watching your GPA and taking the class that you think are going to get you a job, but they're not.
Can I? Well, that's maybe a interesting point to think the difference with Latin American university and education, because precisely they are imposing that kind of discourse, the commodification of
exactly
that
happens in Ayotzinapa for sure, right?
And it's an individual issue, just an individual project. You get a loan and so on, and it's that becomes that put us in an aphoretic situation between, okay, who is the responsible for that? The professor, because he has to provide, because the students has agency here as students and not as individuals. So that's precisely how arose the thing in Ayotzinapa, because the students, the normalists, they think in a collective project. They have their own political organizations, and the state say, no, we have to modernize. This is a commodification. This is a discourse about skills, capacidades y competencias in Spanish, And no, they say no. This is a commodification. This is a privatization of education.
Yeah.
And the same things happens in Chile for many years, and we are fighting about that. Still fighting about that. And they changed the way on how we think about politics and the possibility or the impossibility. Because 10 years ago in Chile, for example, it was impossible to think free education. But today it's the argument for the mainstream politics. In 10 years, it's not too much. This is not going to happen probably in 5 years, but it's there. It's possible. And maybe, nothing changed faster in Mexico, but probably this can put in a visibility not one more, and engaging with today's Obama speaking also, not one more, not one more killed, not one more disappear without the concerning of the civil society. I don't like that word, but I don't know how to say people, because
society.
Yeah, society.
We can remove the civils.
Everyone. And that's interesting also for me as a Latin American studying here. That big and huge difference between the social issues, the social mobilizations, to think that and study, and the university. Because it's a personal, individual issue.
Well, just to be clear, Ayotzinapa is a teaching university, and one of the reasons why it's such a hotspot of conflict is because it shows how absurd our current ideas about education are, right? That an economy that wants to turn us everyone into efficient and cheap workers, that's a model that doesn't fit when you have to teach peasants. And whenever there comes a directive from the central educational authorities in Mexico to them, it makes no sense. There's another student mobilization, for example, that is by engineering students, Because I find that very depressing in the US that people in engineering and business are so disconcerted, that are not concerned at all with these kinds of things, because they're affected all the same. Engineering students in Mexico are resisting a reform of the engineering education in the Polytechnic School in Mexico, where they want to give control of the content of the majors to industry. And they say, you know, for example, if there's two companies that build bridges, so all the civil engineering curriculum is defined by the two main companies, because of course you're gonna get a job in the company, and then, but you know, imagine the amount of power that gives the company over your job, right? If you can only work in the two companies because the two companies work very hard, and I understand that I teach in the University of St. Louis where Monsanto is, and I know how that affects our biotechnology programs. The problem there is not that the company is civil or not, you know, which is true, but not really the fundamental. The fundamental is that if you cater your education only to produce employees, you are robbing the students of a bunch of things, but you're also making them more vulnerable, because when those skills, which will vary over time with technological innovation, when they go away, when whatever you learn in school is no longer useful as a technological matter, you're going to be disposable too.
And this is totally related with what you told previously about the modernization of Latin America, the imposition of the modernization. No, it's not modernity; it's modernization. It's a kind of aggiornamento. No, it's to be in the fashion. No? And that imposition comes, for example, in Mexico with the NAFTA, but also in Latin America with different treaties like that. It's not. It's well. This is a neoliberal imposition, neoliberal fashion, but that means not just economical, or precisely because it's economical, a new organization of the accumulation of capital, for example, that it's an imposition for us, for Latin American countries, to adopt neoliberal models in labor, in health insurance, the privatization of education, the several reforms in judicial structure, and that becomes more complex. The notion of state, or the symbolic power of state, for example, and becomes blurred. This institutional thinking of politics, for example, no, and that's why also it's very difficult to think the political action in this context, because we want more state. What kind of state, and that kind of issues in this contingency in Mexico, it's difficult to see. There are no political projects, for example, to say, well, this is the way where we want to go, for example. But in the outside, for us, for example, as in solidarity, we can do a lot from outside, and precisely here in US, it's pushing all these policies in Latin America from the Washington Consensus. Many years ago, previous to the dictatorship, or precisely the dictatorship comes for that also, no? But this is still happening, no? At this day, it's, for example, the extractivism, depossession, and all these logics, they are working. And well, from here, we can engage to think in a critical way what's happening with that, no? And I think this is the first step, maybe, for our solidarity actions. And then, as you know, we don't have many time right now, and I really appreciate, we appreciate that you come. But today, for example, it's the November 20, the Revolution Day in Mexico, but it's also the day of general strike. Right now, they are departing the big march in Mexico City and all the cities are in Mexico, but also here in LA. So if you want to engage, today it's a march from Plaza Olvera to the Mexican Consulate in MacArthur Park at 4 p.m. And the meeting in the Mexican Consulate, it's at 5 p.m. So you are welcome to participate.
Thank you, Cesar. And thank you, Cesar, for organizing this teaching. Thank you, Ignacio, for speaking with us and sharing. And thank you to all of you for attending this event. Hopefully you've had a chance to sign this sheet. If you haven't, please do. We'd like to continue discussing this and other situations. But with that, I think we're already over time, so I'd like to give you a chance to get to whatever else you have planned this afternoon. And thanks again for coming, and hopefully we'll meet again soon.